This is Podcast Theory.
Hello again, fellow podcaster, and welcome back to Podcast Theory. I am your host, Jason Sircone, and today it is part 5 of this 6-part series talking about the critical things that you need to think about before launching your podcast. If you haven't taken in the first 4 episodes in this series, I highly recommend you do just that as soon as you finish listening to today's episode. The 4 episodes before this are jam-packed with information about what you need to be thinking about as you bring your podcast to life. Today, I want to talk about something that's an extension of what I've talked about in the past few episodes. Really, what this digs into is making a big deal out of your launch. So let's officially title this episode Part 5, Promoting and Executing Your Podcast Launch. Now, this is just the quintessential first piece of all of the other pieces coming together, because honestly, it's not just about the launch, it's about what you're going to do with your podcast beyond your launch. However, that said, if you have a more successful launch, it's going to build a stronger foundation on which you can grow those future episodes. So let's break this down and dive in. When podcasts get launched, and this, again, if you've listened to this series or pretty much any episode in this season of Podcast Theory, you've heard me talking about the statistic of 90% of podcasts don't get beyond 3 episodes. I think that stat exists because the strategy isn't focusing enough on having a powerful launch. And I've said this in past episodes as well. If you are properly strategizing your podcast launch, whether it's a season or whether it's just the beginning of what's going to be a weekly show, your strategy should have in place a directive that says you will record more than 3 episodes before you go live. The world has existed this long without your podcast. It can wait until you have your legs underneath you. So understanding what you want to talk about as you bring your podcast to life is going to make this a lot easier. So going through the strategy and building that out, think about all the things that you want to focus on and then start building out your episode content from there. Mixed in there may be nothing but solo episodes. Maybe it's all guest interviews. Maybe it's a combination of both, which is it's really the mix that I like, because having those solo episodes will help position you as the expert, as the authority, and make listeners realize this is your podcast and you are the one bringing all this great information to them. The conversations that you have with others that you collaborate with just as much are going to bring people in and help highlight you as a great guest interviewer and put you in a great spotlight, but it's also going to put the spotlight on that guest as well. So it goes without saying that if you have 2 people on the microphone, by definition, the expertise in the room is going to get split, because there's going to be 2 voices offering expertise, offering points and counterpoints. And hopefully, if there's chemistry and there's synergy between host and guest, it's going to make the content sparkle, because people tune in, they're going to hear a great conversation, they're going to want to be a part of it. And I've talked to people that have felt like listening to it. They said the good podcasts, the ones that make them feel like they're in the room with them, it feels like they're sitting at the next table at the coffee shop and they're eavesdropping because they're hearing them talk about great things that they're interested in. That's a great thing. That's where you want to get to with your content. So putting emphasis on how you want to build that content out is only going to make for a more successful launch when you get to that point. Now, stated on past episodes, if you haven't thought about having a big number in the bank, already recorded, ready to go, fully produced, just in place in case life gets in the way and you can't sit down and record an episode, or you have a guest that needs to reschedule on you, you're not in a bad spot to where you're not putting an episode out. So getting ready for launch, whether you're doing a full season, okay, let's break this down. By week, if you're doing a weekly show, you want to make sure that you have 10 to 15 episodes recorded. That way, you can have a strong launch where you can launch 5 of your episodes and still have content in the bank. That way, Once your episodes are live, you can start to evaluate feedback. You can see how people are responding to what you've put out, and you've still got 5 episodes that you can draw from. So for the next 5 weeks, you're not going to be behind. In that time frame, you're going to also want to make sure that you set yourself up to have another batch recording session so you can put more content in the bank. If you're doing a season, if you launch the whole season all at once, that's what I like, because I think of the world like Netflix, like Hulu, like Prime. When the seasons go live, I think in most cases, I could be wrong, there could be some that go out in spurts. I know I'm a Cobra Kai fan, and I'm on the edge of my seat waiting for part 2 of season 6, because they broke season 6 into 3-part releases, I believe, where it's first 5 episodes, now the next 5 are whatever. That's broken up, so that's a little bit different. But the point I'm driving at is with your seasons, you give your people exactly what they're showing up for. It's a wealth of content. It creates a resource, a number of benefits to releasing your content that way. In order to get to that point, you need to have everything recorded. So make sure you're setting yourself up to have the whole season go out at once. And then you can draw content from that season. You can position your marketing to point towards specific episodes or even specific points within those episodes. And then you can supplement that content with live streams and other things along the way. When it gets launched to launch time, and you want to bring this to the world in a big way. Think about this. Now, again, we said the 3-episode thing, it sometimes feels like maybe a test balloon went out there to see if maybe a podcast would be a good idea. And we tried a second one and the world didn't show up. So we'll try a third, and all of a sudden, kaput, podcast goes away. We don't want that to happen. I want you to succeed at this. I want you to be in a good position to grow. And I want your podcast to mean something for you and your brand. When it means something to you, you can actually feel it ingrained in everything you do to develop your brand and even your personal brand. And that could run alongside your business or just be you, positioning yourself as the person that wants to talk about this content and talk about these subjects. Putting yourself in a position to succeed starts with a launch that is treated like a big deal. You know me. If you've listened or watched Podcast Theory, you know I like to draw a lot of comparisons to podcasting from television. So when a television network is launching a brand new show, they make a big deal out of that show, don't they? They run ads. They do tons of positioning. They've got press releases. They've got social media content. They've got all kinds of things to draw your attention to this show going live. This could be something brand new, or if it's the new season of an established show, they do these things prior to the actual first episode going live, so you get excited. It's just like anything else that's ever been promoted in the world. You think of movies. Trailers are usually designed for in-theater consumption when you go to see a movie, and then when it gets closer to that movie being live in the theater for you to watch, you start seeing it in different arenas. Start seeing it on television. You start seeing it and hearing it on the radio. You start seeing it online, on the internet, on social media, you name it, across the board. Promotion is key. The idea here is that you want to get your listeners excited for what they're going to consume. In order to do that, you want to utilize your content to its fullest extent, and leaning into the content repurposing side of things. Making a big deal out of your launch means you just have to repurpose your content and start using it sooner than you might have normally done. I've talked about this on past podcasts. It's one of those anomalies that I think about. We're always looking for new content to put into the world, right? Believe me, I'm as guilty of this as anybody. If we're planning out our production with efficiency in mind, and we're doing those batch recording sessions like I talked about in the previous episode, we're lining ourselves up to have a nice amount of content in the bank. So when that episode's ready to go live, we're not trying to scramble to put something together. We just go to the bank, we pull one out, we do everything we need to create assets, we have it ready to go. But typically what happens is when a podcaster is proactive and they are getting themselves in a position to be ready to put content out without having to scramble, they've usually got a number of episodes in the bank. But that content just sits in the bank for months. And then all of a sudden, when it's time to go live, that's when they pull it out. That's when they pull the clips. That's when they start sharing. In reality, and again, I'm saying this, I'm as guilty of this as anybody. In reality, what we should be doing is we should be pulling out that content weeks in advance and sharing clips So listeners and viewers of our social media accounts, anybody in our orbit can see what we have coming and they can start to get excited. That's going to plant seeds in a viewer's mind, in a listener's mind. Oh man, they're talking to so and so, or they're talking about this. I really want to know more about that. So now they're thinking, okay, I'm going to lock this date in. I know when this is going live. It's just like when you get excited for any other type of entertainment, there's typically a certain amount of hype that leads in to that content becoming live to the world. Your podcast should be no different. So if you are launching a brand new show and you're not hyping it up beforehand, you're doing it wrong. You absolutely need to think about how you present this material to your target listener, to your target viewer, because the more you make a big deal out of it and hype it up, the more excited a person's going to get, but they're going to see how bought in to that content you truly are. That's going to make them feel an attachment to this content before they ever fully hear everything you've got for them. And you want to entice them. You want to give them that insider's look. That everybody loves the behind the scenes stuff. You could go to that route, or go that route with it by taking some shots from your recording session, share some B-roll, share some videos, do a little behind the scenes mini documentary. But in and out of that, even if you don't go to that extent, you still have all the content from your episodes that you can pull from, and you've got so much at your disposal. Every episode has so much content that you can work with, and you can position that content to be hyping people up and exciting people and hyping up what you're bringing them far beyond the actual launch. And that's something you want to focus on, is making the biggest deal possible out of your podcast launch. That's going to get people excited. It's going to get them into your orbit before you ever fully press the publish button. That's what it's all about. And that's the message that I'm delivering to you today. Think about all the content that you'll have at your disposal and utilize it to its fullest extent. Now, you don't want to just blow everything out right away and just take every video piece that you have or every video clip that you have and throw it all out at once, but you want to use it in drips and drabs to get people pumped up, get them fired up for what they're going to experience when your show goes live. I've done this. I did this with the first season of Let's Blow This Up. I was doing previews leading up to the first season, and it got notoriety because of that, because I had people saying, this is great, I can't wait to hear it. And that way, when the episodes went live, it wasn't the first time they were hearing about it. Any questions they might have were already answered through the clips that I was sharing, and then the captions that explained this is what this episode was about. And when I dove into this full conversation with so-and-so, now you learn more. You're going to learn more about what you're going to experience, but you know that show's coming. And I kept tagging the date and saying this is when it's going live. And then when the full season went live, I had a more successful launch because people were aware and they were ready for it. Plus, my guests were on board with sharing that content and getting it spread around too. So there's a lot that you can do before your show goes live, but the launch sometimes gets misconstrued with this. Well, we've got this episode done. Let's see what happens if we throw it out into the world. But you have to take into consideration the amount of content people are consuming and the amount of content people are getting put in front of them on a daily basis. We have to have a filtering process. And just like anything else when it comes to advertising, people need to see some things, or need to see all things, many, many times before they take action. And you're no different. I'm no different. We need to see things multiple times before we start to build that trust, even if it's to the point where we might pay attention to it for a couple minutes longer than we first did. The more we see something, we might say, all right, let me give this a little bit more of my attention and see if it's worth it. If you're just throwing out that first podcast episode saying, hey, we got a podcast now, check it out, chances are maybe the closest, the most powerful fans you have, the biggest ones you have, they may say, okay, great, yeah, I'm diving in. But the ones that are outside of that, it's going to take a little bit more. So you can't just throw your podcast out there with one episode and say, here, let's see what happens, because more than likely, whatever does happen is not going to meet the expectations that you have in mind, which again goes right back to what I was saying about that 90% 3-episode deal that we've talked about ad nauseum here on Podcast Theory. Bottom line, your podcast launch needs to be a big deal, because think of all the work that you put into it. Think of everything you've done to bring your podcast to the world. It was a lot, right? There was a lot of preparation. There was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. There was a lot of learning. There is so much that went in to building this production. You don't want to just throw it out there and see what happens. You want to put it out there in a major way, and you want to be damn proud to do it. You want to be damn proud to stand behind it and say, look what we've created. We have a story to tell, and the podcast is the stage on which we've chosen to tell it. We want you to listen because we know that you are going to get something from this content. That's what it's all about. But you got to give people an inside look at how it's all coming together. And you already have the content created because you're just repurposing content from your episodes and you're using it sooner than you more than likely had planned. So make a huge deal out of your launch. And I've talked about this before, not to go into a self-plug mode, but in my VIP days, this is a big thing that we talk about. We talk about the launch strategy because you want to be in a position to win. And you want to be in a position where your show takes off successfully so you have a foundation on which things can grow. And that is my segue into tomorrow's episode as we cap this off. I'm sorry, not tomorrow's episode. That is my segue into the next episode of Podcast Theory, which is part 6 in this 6-part series, talking about what comes after the launch, what you need to be thinking about as your podcast goes to the next phase. You're off the ground. Now what? We're going to talk about that in more detail. So that's going to bring today's episode to a conclusion. This was part 5 of the 6-part series of critical things you need to be thinking about before you launch your podcast. Part 6, as I said, I already spoiled it by saying we're going to talk about what comes next. Make sure you're locked in for that episode as well. Until our paths cross again on that episode, my name is Jason Sircone. This has been Podcast Theory. Good talk. I'll see you out there.